At 76, Charles finally admitted what so many had suspected for decades. His entire life was shaped by denial, deception, and carefully constructed propaganda. Born in November 1948, Charles entered a world where duty always came before self. His mother, Elizabeth, wasn't just a parent, she was the queen. The same woman who tucked him in at night would disappear for months on Commonwealth tours, leaving him in the care of nannies. His father, Prince Philip, tried to harden him, sending him off to Gordonstown, a harsh boarding school in Scotland. There, Charles was mocked, bullied, and left humiliated. In private letters, he described it as hell on earth. These emotional wounds stayed with him, teaching him early on that vulnerability had no place in his world. But buried emotions don't die quietly. Eventually they erupted in scandal. The public watched Charles become a man but never saw the boy starved of affection. That early emotional neglect haunted every relationship he formed. Over 20 serious relationships came and went, actresses, aristocrats, celebrities, each discarded because none of them were quite right. The truth was, Charles was never allowed to marry for love. The monarchy demanded a match that served its image. By the late 1970s, the pressure to marry became unbearable. His uncle, Lord Mountbatten, urged him to find a bride who was young, pure, and from noble lineage. That's when Diana Spencer came into the picture. She was a shy teenager, barely out of childhood, but she checked every box. What few knew was that Charles was already in love with his former flame, Camilla, the same woman who would later be blamed for breaking a marriage and triggering a modern royal crisis. When Charles proposed to Diana in February 1981, the engagement interview revealed more than most people noticed. Asked if they were in love, Diana replied immediately, "Of course." Charles paused, then said the now infamous line, "Whatever in love means." It wasn't a joke, it was a warning. But no one was listening. The wedding that followed, in July 1981, was broadcast to 750 million people and sold as a fairy tale. Behind the palace walls, it felt more like a tragedy in slow motion. Just days before the ceremony, Diana discovered a bracelet Charles had made for Camilla. Engraved with the letters G and EF, nicknames for Gladys and Fred, their private pet names. When Diana confronted him, she was met with silence and a system that demanded obedience. The monarchy told her to stay quiet, and that silence followed her into marriage. Charles continued seeing Camilla, denying it to everyone, including Diana. But the truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deeply it's buried, leaving a trail of phone calls, secret meetings, and gifts. Charles's affair with Camilla became increasingly difficult to hide. The press began circling, and Diana felt more and more trapped. Years later, she admitted that on the day she walked down the aisle, she already knew she was marrying 3 people. By the mid-1980s, the cracks in the marriage were undeniable. Diana battled bulimia, a condition fueled by stress, isolation, and betrayal. Charles grew colder and more distant, investing himself completely in Camilla. Their private conversations were eventually recorded and leaked, becoming some of the most humiliating scandals the royal family had ever faced. One of the most infamous moments came in 1993, with the publication of what became known as the Camilla-gator, Tampon-gate tape. In it, Charles was heard telling Camilla he wished he could live inside her trousers, and even joked about being reincarnated as her tampon. The conversation was beyond embarrassing. It was a national scandal. For Charles, it exposed what he had spent years trying to keep secret. But the public still didn't grasp the full depth of the situation. These tapes revealed something more disturbing, that Charles had never truly intended to give up Camilla. Not for Diana, not for his royal duties, not even for the crown. As the details became public, people started asking questions. Why was Diana, the most photographed woman in the world, visibly crumbling while Charles pursued Camilla so openly? Why was the monarchy willing to let Diana suffer in silence, just to protect Charles? And more disturbingly, what lengths had Charles gone to in order to keep the truth hidden? The official narrative was that Charles and Diana were simply incompatible. It wasn't incompatibility, it was betrayal. sustained and sanctioned by the very institution that was supposed to protect her. Even Queen Elizabeth eventually stepped in and demanded their separation in 1992. By then, it was no longer about saving the marriage, it was about damage control. Despite everything, Charles continued to present a composed public image. But what was he really trying to protect? His personal reputation? The monarchies? Or something far more complex? When he finally admitted the truth after decades of silence, it wasn't just about Camilla. It was about the institution itself. About layers of deception, cover-ups. They became etched into the monarchy itself. The same questions Britain had quietly asked for years were now impossible to ignore. He was not the fairy tale heir his mother had presented. He wasn't the shining prince of the people's imagination. He became the monarch shaped by scandal, betrayal, and the ghost of a woman the world never stopped loving. Every moment of Charles's reign has been haunted by Diana's memory. The silence that fell over Britain during her funeral still lingers in the public's collective consciousness. Her 1995 interview, where she declared, "There were 3 of us in this marriage," did more damage to Charles's public image than any headline ever could. What many people didn't know, though, was that even before that moment, Charles had already been caught in an even deeper scandal the palace tried desperately to suppress. It all circled back to Camilla. In 1993, the leak of their intimate phone call stunned the world. Dubbed Camillagate, it forced the British press into an ethical crisis over how much of the explicit details they could even print. Charles's late-night words to Camilla, his fantasies of being her underwear, weren't just tabloid fodder. They were undeniable proof that while Diana was putting on a brave face, while the public believed in a royal fairy tale, Charles had been living a double life, already showing. The damage done by years of secrecy, betrayal, and emotional distance had left marks not just on him, but on everyone around him. The country had once desperately wanted to believe in the fairy tale marriage of Charles and Diana, but his heart and body had always been elsewhere. For many Britons, this wasn't just a scandal. It felt like a betrayal of everything the monarchy was supposed to represent. But the affair wasn't just an affair. It was the symptom of something much deeper. Charles had chosen Camilla long before the crown, long before Diana, long before he was expected to carry the weight of royal duty. He had met her in the early 1970s and fallen in love almost immediately. She was too experienced, too outspoken, too unrefined for the spotless image expected of a future king's wife. So the palace quietly removed her from the equation. And when Diana came along, young, beautiful, and seemingly untouched by life, she wasn't just a bride, she was a solution, carefully selected symbol of innocence, to repair the cracks Charles had already caused. But symbols can't live like real people. Diana discovered that hard truth almost immediately. On their honeymoon, she found cufflinks engraved with the initials C&C, a gift from Camilla. She saw the signs, photos, letters, quiet phone calls. Deep down, she knew the marriage had never been whole. She confronted Charles about it. His response was cold and cruel. "I refuse to be the only Prince of Wales who never had a mistress." That sentence revealed more about Charles than years of public speeches ever could. What the public didn't fully see was the power struggle behind palace walls. Outside Buckingham Palace, Diana was adored. But inside, she was seen as a disruption. She was labeled emotional, unstable, difficult. What those whispering courtiers never acknowledged was that her pain had been cultivated by the betrayal she endured. She had been promised a partnership and given loneliness. Watching her husband openly love another woman while denying her affection created a kind of emotional torture, and the marriage became a battleground of resentment, jealousy, irons, and heartbreak. Diana's mental health crumbled under the pressure. She developed bulimia, spoke publicly about her despair, eventually sought emotional connection outside the marriage because she wasn't receiving it inside her own home. And the fallout didn't end with her, it bled into her children's lives. William and Harry, young boys at the time, were caught between two worlds. They adored their mother, but were bound by blood to the man who had caused her so much pain. Years later, Harry admitted that he carried deep scars, that Camilla's eventual place beside Charles, as his wife left wounds that had never fully healed. Still, Charles moved forward, through scandal, separation, and even Diana's tragic death in 1997. He remained determined to reshape the story. Slowly, carefully, he reintroduced Camilla to the public, rebranding her image from mistress to companion, from outsider to royal partner. It was not an easy journey. But by 2005, he had convinced the establishment to accept her, and they were married in a quiet ceremony. Even then, though, the compromise was clear. Camilla would not be queen. She would be known only as queen consort. It was a nod to Diana's legacy, subtle but pointed message. The public would not forgive if the woman Diana was betrayed, forever sat on the throne in full. But time, as always, began to soften the edges. By the time Queen Elizabeth II passed, in 2022, Camilla had been recast in the public imagination. No longer the villain of the 1990s, she was accepted if not embraced by many, and on the day of Charles's coronation, she stood beside him and was crowned queen. For those who remember Diana's heartbreak, it was a moment that stung. For Charles, it was the fulfillment of a choice he had made decades earlier, not the crown first, not the country first. Camilla Dote, in interviews approaching his 76th year. When asked what love truly meant to him, Charles finally said what had always been obvious to those watching. Camilla had always been the one. And by then, the fractures within his family were no longer hidden, they were public, exposed, and unresolved. The man who had once been shaped by duty had, in the end, chosen desire. And that decision, more than any title or crown, defined the king he became. Fairy tale had shattered completely. Secrecy could no longer protect the monarchy from the raw truth that had been hiding in plain sight. Anna's death left the world reeling. The public grief was not just for a princess, but for a symbol of honesty, vulnerability, and humanity within an institution known for control. And standing in the shadow of that loss was Charles Att, once the grieving ex-husband and the man many silently blamed. The presence of Camilla, always lingering in the background, made it harder for the country to heal. For Charles, those years were brutal, not just personally, but as the longest-serving heir in British history, endlessly waiting to ascend a throne that often felt more like a punishment than a prize. The palace could manage appearances, stage events, control narratives, but it couldn't erase what had been said and done. Still, Charles didn't walk away. Despite the whispers, the headlines, the disgrace, he held on. He poured his efforts into causes he cared about: architecture, the environment, and his charitable work with the Prince's Trust. He tried to reshape his image into something future-facing, modern, and compassionate. Yet no matter how many speeches he gave or trees he planted, the public never fully forgot the sound of his voice on that leaked tape, or the look in Diana's eyes during her final years. For a long time, Camilla remained in the shadows. At events, she entered through side doors, left through back exits, and was rarely seen beside Charles in official photos. The palace knew the risk one misstep could bring public outrage roaring back. But time, as always, began to change things. Charles waited, patiently, carefully, gradually. He introduced Camilla into public life, knowing that consistency could soften judgment, and it did. Their bond didn't waver, and even those who had once condemned the relationship started to accept that, whatever else could be said. Camilla had always stayed, but Diana's death left questions that never really went away. Why hadn't Charles fought harder to save the marriage? Why hadn't he fought harder to be with Camilla before marrying Diana at all? Even as he rebuilt his public image, those doubts hung in the air. When the truth came out about how Diana's infamous 1995 Panorama interview had been manipulated by journalist Martin Bashir using deceptive tactics, some rushed to defend Charles, saying he'd been unfairly vilified. But the emotional damage had already been done. Millions had watched Diana speak about her loneliness, her despair, her sense of being trapped inside a system designed to strip her of identity, and they believed her. At the center of that pain stood Charles. What does it do to a man to spend most of his life waiting to be king? while the world openly questions whether he even deserves it. Charles never answered that question directly, but in rare interviews, he spoke of how suffocating the press had been, how misunderstood he often felt. Still, none of it could fully erase the sense that he had let Diana down. The public forgave his quirks, his abstract speeches, even his now infamous remarks caught on tape. But they never entirely forgave him for what happened to Diana and what didn't happen to save her. And yet by his 70s, Charles finally had what he had always wanted. Camilla was no longer hidden. She was by his side, not in secret, but in full view, publicly recognized and ultimately crowned queen. Consort after Queen Elizabeth II's death. For decades, he had been told this moment would never come. Now, the public would never allow it. But they did. Somehow, the monarchy managed to rewrite the script, glossing over the scandals and presenting the union not as betrayal, but as destiny, fulfilled, still. When Charles turned 76 and began to speak more openly about the past, there was no sense of victory in his words. What came through instead was a quiet, somber acknowledgement. He spoke of the failures his own, the pain he had caused, the mistakes that cost people more than he could repay. He admitted finally that the marriage to Diana had never been what it appeared, that he had loved Camilla all along, that duty, image, and the institution had forced decisions that left scars on everyone involved. It wasn't an apology. Was something harder a confrontation with the truth? For decades, people had whispered about what really happened. At 76, Charles confirmed it. His heart had never truly belonged to Diana, not in the way the world hoped, not in the way she needed, not in the way she deserved. That one truth finally spoken shifted everything. It didn't erase the past, but it gave it shape. The fairy tale had always been a lie. Now there was no more pretending. But before that confession was made, one final reckoning remained. Charles's loyalty to Camilla had never just been a private decision. It had become a public humiliation for Diana, for the monarchy, and for himself. The system had been built on secrecy, but secrecy no longer worked. After Diana's death in 1997, the truth had nowhere left to hide. When the nation wept for Diana, Charles faced something far colder: fury. Crowds booed him openly. Newspapers overflowed with letters demanding he never be allowed to become king. And Camilla, the woman he had risked everything to protect, was pushed into hiding. Years she couldn't stand beside him. Her presence was too controversial, too painful, too soon. That national resentment that Charles had chosen personal desire over public duty ever really faded. It followed him, clinging to every appearance, every photo, every royal engagement. It was the cost of a choice that history would never allow him to forget. So why speak now at 76? Why admit what everyone had already long suspected? Because by then, the truth had already corroded the institution. No matter how carefully the palace crafted his image, the stain of the past remained. Charles knew he would never be remembered as a warrior king, a visionary reformer, or even as a beloved sovereign. He would be remembered for one thing: turning his back on Diana and standing unwaveringly by Camilla. But his admission wasn't just personal, it was historical. In confirming that his marriage to Diana had been an arrangement he never wanted, he validated something Diana had said decades earlier, something the royal establishment had worked hard to dismiss as overblown emotion. Heard words from that 1995 Panorama interview: "There were 3 of us in this marriage," were now finally acknowledged by the king himself. The woman they tried to silence was right all along. That's what made the confession devastating. It wasn't just a story of adultery. It was a betrayal played out on the world's largest stage. A betrayal of a woman, a betrayal of sons, a betrayal of a nation that had once believed in a fairy tale. For decades, Charles had buried the truth under protocol and silence. But at 76, he said it out loud. Diana had been sacrificed, and the consequences of that sacrifice had shaped not only his life, but the lives of his sons, William and Harry. The image of those boys walking behind their mother's coffin still haunts Britain. And now, as grown men, they carry the weight of their father's confession in entirely different ways. William, the future king, has always played the role of the steady heir, rarely speaking publicly about the pain, always holding the monarchy together. Harry, in contrast, chose to confront it, to name it, to tear it wide open. In interviews and memoirs, he accused the monarchy of never truly reckoning with what it had done to his mother. Now, with Charles's admission, their family fracture found a center. The truth that had been avoided for decades was finally spoken. Their father admitted it, but the timing raises questions. Was this raw honesty, or was it a calculated move? A way to finally secure Camilla's place, not just beside him, but in history? Because with that confession came another declaration. Charles defended Camilla, publicly and emotionally. He called her his truest companion, his constant. He asked the nation to see her not as the villain of Diana's story, but as the woman who had stood beside him through every storm. The same woman who once entered through side doors and left through back ones now sat beside him, crowned in Buckingham Palace, and Charles wanted the world to know it had always been her. Still, Diana's presence has never faded. Her image lingers in murals, her voice resurfaces in documentaries, and her memory continues to cast a long shadow over the monarchy. And now, that shadow carries the echo of Charles's confession. There is no more denial, no more carefully managed silence. The fairy tale marriage was never real. Truth had been suppressed, but it could not be erased. The monarchy, of course, will continue. William will ascend. Kate will become queen. History will move forward. But it will never move past this moment. Charles will not be remembered for his coronation, or his charitable causes, or his decades of preparation. He will be remembered for what he said at 76, the words that finally told the truth. The words that defined his reign not with legacy, but with confession. He chose Camilla. He lost Diana. And in doing so, he rewrote not just his story, but the monarchy's. That is his legacy. Not the crown, not the title, but the truth, spoken too late and remembered forever.